Hello, comic creators. Welcome back to the pre New York Comic Con edition of the Business of Comics podcast. We are going to go through the structure in the same way that we always do. I'm going to start with the major news stories of the past 2 weeks. Then we're going to have a more in depth conversation about the biggest challenge to comic book creators on any level. And then we're going to open up the floor and answer questions. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat and I will get to them in the order in which they are received. Please keep in mind, this is not going to be legal advice and we are not establishing an attorney client relationship because that's just not how it works. So let's start with the big story of the past 2 weeks, which is actually a continuation of what we were talking about a couple weeks ago. Crunchyroll, the anime streaming service, announced this week that they're expanding their offerings to create a line of digital manga in addition to their video service. At the same time, Marvel has announced that they're going to go day and date with Global Comics right after New York Comic Con. Now, this is follows closely on the heels of Disney announcing a new digital comics platform with Webtoon, and DC also announcing they were going to go day and date with Global Comics. Now, just to clarify what day and date means, it basically means, for the purposes of comics, that the print version and the digital version of any given comic will come out on the same day, on the same date. Now, this is different than what has traditionally happened in the past because traditionally, since the rise of digital comics, the print version would come out first and the digital version would be released later, even though it is actually easier and faster to release a digital copy than a print copy. This was done in the comic book industry to help support the direct market, the comic book shops, and give them some lead time to actually sell books relative to what was going on the digital side. But the fact that these new initiatives are being announced, I think actually leads to a couple of conclusions. I don't think that a lot of these movements are happening because comic book publishers are somehow abandoning print comics or they're seeing the turmoil happening with the Diamond bankruptcy and deciding to put their efforts elsewhere because the print comic audience and the digital comic audience is not necessarily the same audience. There is some overlap in that Venn diagram, but by and large, those two different demographics are distinct. What I do think it means is that publishers are now looking at the success of something like Webtoon, especially after their IPO, and deciding that they also want to tap into that market. They're looking to create new fans for their books among digital natives, people who can't or won't go to a comic book shop or don't even know where a comic book shop is to take advantage of it. If they can actually go to where the new readers are, and the new readers have their phones and that's where they're looking for content, it makes sense to try and get more fans, especially if you know you're going to spin these things out into TV shows and movies and video games anyway. Push the comics the same way you're going to push all the other content and expand your offering overall. Now, as an independent creator, it makes sense with all of these moves that if you have not actually decided on a digital distribution model, that you make a serious consideration of where you can actually put your digital comics to take advantage of this potential increased interest and the new people coming into the market. There are some people that think if Marvel and DC go into a platform like Global Comics, it will actually repress and push down all of the independents that are currently thriving on Global Comics because they'll just get drowned out by, the quote unquote big two. But if you look at the way digital algorithms work, especially in a platform like Global Comics or Webtoons or anything like that, you'll see that for every comic that a person reads, there are going to be several other comics that are going to be suggested to them, either through the also like or through the ratings or through people sharing comics with each other. So there is a chance, depending on how you release your comic and where you position your comic in with your keywords and everything else, you can actually ride the wave created by a DC or a Marvel instead of getting buried underneath it. The second big story is related to the increase in celebrity comics coming from independent publishers. Earlier this week, Axl Rose announced that he was going to have an ongoing comic book series with Sumerian Comics, and social media celebrity Inyana Sarkis announced she was going to have a new graphic novel with Vault. Now, the fact that celebrities are actually becoming comic creators is not a new thing. There is a long history of actors and musicians becoming comic book creators. One of the biggest crowdfunding projects of all time was the Keanu Reeves Berserker project that he did with Boom. What's interesting here is that someone like Axl Rose, who people may not know unless you were born in the late 1900s, and a social media celebrity who was became very prominent only right around the time of COVID are both getting into comic books now in a way that may actually not show up at all in something like the direct market. Because the idea that an Axl Rose comic is going to sell tens of thousands of comics in a comic book shop isn't likely. But the magic of it is they don't have to. Because they have established fan bases, they can go and produce a comic and sell that comic directly to the fans they already have and sell significant amounts of comics. For example, Inyana Sarkis has about 3.8 million YouTube followers. So if 1% of those people actually buy her comic, she's selling over 35,000 units of a comic. Keep in mind, the number one issue of most comics only sell about 5,000 copies. So we're talking about a sevenfold increase right out of the gate, potentially. The other thing is if a media celebrity who has a substantial following then comes to a producer or a studio with a comic, the idea that they could leverage that into another type of media property, where, by the way, they are the star because the protagonist of the comic invariably looks just like the celebrity, it's very easy for them to get that kind of media deal. And that kind of media deal is more attractive to a risk averse studio than a comic from an unknown creator, even if that comic may, from an objective standpoint, have more quality. So now that we've talked about the big stories of the week, let's actually talk about the biggest challenge being a comic book creator, having a career in comics. And when people ask me this question, a lot of times they think I'm going to talk about predatory publishers or the high cost of producing comics or marketing competition or distribution nightmares. And while all of those things are real and they do actually impact the way comics are produced and the way it will impact your career, the biggest problem in being a comic book creator is the fact that you love comics, and that love is often used against you in detrimental ways. 95% of the people who are in comics, especially my clients, they are in comics because they love comics. They're not in comics because they think they're going to make huge amounts of money. A lot of them grew up with the characters and the stories that they found in comic books. They turned to comic books for comfort and inspiration and guidance and, for to a certain extent, companionship and everything else. And depending on when you grew up, especially if you grew up in the late 1900s, you risked rejection from family and friends, you risked ridicule, you risked punishment from teachers and librarians and everything else. And depending on where you lived and what your situation was, you may have even risked physical violence in orders for you to keep reading comics. And you kept reading comics anyway. So comic books are a part of who you are and you love it. So that's where your focus comes from. But if you've been in any kind of situation outside of comics where you love something or someone, you realize you're not necessarily prone to make the most pragmatic choices when it comes to that situation. In terms of comics, two creators who are friends who get really excited about an idea, they will go out and they will make a comic without ever sitting down to discuss the business or legal realities of what it is that they are making. An artist might sign a very onerous deal with a publisher because they want a chance to draw their favorite character, not realizing what they are giving up in the process. By the same token, a writer could search for a creator owned deal for years. And then when he finds one, he'll sign it because he wants to see his book on the shelf. The deal could be horrible, and in many cases it is, but because they love the idea of their comic being in the world, they will take that bad deal. Even someone who's decided to publish their comic independently might come to a situation where they have maxed out their credit cards, they've drained their savings account to get this book out into the world because they did not make prudent choices about the comic they were producing while they were producing it. Now, I think the key in overcoming this challenge is not to get into a situation where you do not love comics or you see comics as some kind of product like breakfast cereal or soap or something. The key is to balance your creative passion with a certain amount of business calculation. So in certain parts of the process of creating your comic, you should focus on your love for the medium, your love for your stories and your characters and your craft, and not worry about the business issues that are invariably going to come up when you publish a comic. At certain other points in that process, you have to turn off your passion for the comic and simply look at the business and legal realities of the publishing industry at the point where you are releasing your comic. The comic at that point becomes what the lawyers refer to it as intellectual property. It becomes a product, and you treat that product in a way to maximize the revenue and the reach of that product. And you do not rely on hope. You do not rely on goodwill. You don't rely on your love for the story at that point, because at that point, it's about making good decisions for the comic long term. Now, some people can flip that switch internally, often instantaneously, between artist and merchant, and they can go back and forth when the need calls for it. And in a lot of cases, they can be very successful if it is a little schizophrenic. Other people actually rely on a business partner or a spouse or someone else who is more invested in you and your success than comics as a medium. So they will focus on the marketing and the distribution and the printing and the storage and final order cutoff dates and all those other things, while you focus on the craft of being a comics creator. Neither one of these options is better or worse than the other, but if you go at it that way, you can actually turn your love for comics into an asset as opposed to a liability. So that's going to be the end of my rant. Um, let's see what's going on in the comment section so we can actually. What's the best order to handle intellectual property protection for an indie comic? Let's see. There's more here, but I don't know. Let's see. Here we go. Copyright, trademark for the series title, or business registration. Okay. And which of these actually provides the most strength if someone copies your idea? Okay. Um, let's start with the first question first. When in the process of publishing a comic, and this is laid out completely in the book, The Business of Independent Comic Book Publishing, the initial step in terms of protecting your comic is to protect the initial idea, because your idea, when it's in your head, can't be protected by anyone. If you go around talking about your idea and you've never actually written it down, anyone can actually take it and it's gone. Once you actually create what's called in the legal industry a fixed medium of expression for your comic, then you have a copyright in your comic. And that means you could have drawn it, you could have written it down, you could have recorded it on an audio note, you could have, I don't know, scratched it on the wall of your apartment. But don't do that, because that's not a good way to do it. But when you've done that, you have created a copyright. The issue is no one knows you have a copyright, and especially the government, the Library of Congress, doesn't know you have a copyright until you register it with the Copyright Office. That is often the first thing you should do, even if you only have a character design, character sketch, or a script, or a synopsis, or anything you have at the initial stage. You should copyright that first. The reason you should copyright that first is because the time frame that you have for copyright protection begins when you actually register it with the Copyright Office. And it lasts for the rest of your life plus another 70 years. So as soon as you have your initial idea written down, you can go online and you can register that copyright. In a couple weeks, I'm going to I'm going to post a video going step by step into how to file a copyright. But just understand right now that A, it is not complex. B, you do not need a lawyer. C, it is not expensive. It's $65. That's going to be the first thing that you do. The second thing that you're going to want to do is decide whether you want to actually create a company related to your comic book publishing. Now, if you're only going to publish one comic, or you don't plan to do this long term, then a company may not make sense. But if you're going to be publishing on an ongoing basis, whether you're going to be doing it independently or freelance or creator owned, in most cases, it makes sense to create a company, even if you create what's called a single member LLC, which is a legal entity that you own, you control, but is separate from you from a legal standpoint. Once you have that business, then you can actually take advantage of certain legal protections and tax incentives to actually support your comic. And then once you're actually getting a separate bank account for your company and you're going through the production, you produce the comic has been printed and published and sent out into the world, file another copyright registration for the finished comic. Because what the Copyright Office is looking for is what's called the best and latest version of your comic. Now, when you did the script and you didn't have a comic, the best version was the script, because that's all that there was. When the comic is actually released, the best version is going to be the printed version. And then you will have the copyright protection in both the story, in the text, and in the art. You don't really have to worry about a trademark until and unless you have multiple issues of the same comic, because you cannot get a trademark in one issue of a comic. And a trademark is separate from a copyright. We will talk about that in a couple of videos down the line. But when you're actually you have the title of your book, or the logo of your book, or the logo of your character. All of those things can be trademarked, and they should be trademarked if you're going to have an ongoing series, or if you're going to start producing other products related to the comic, like t-shirts or posters or hats or whatever. So that's going to be the sequence: copyright, business registration, copyright for the finished product, and then maybe a trademark. Once you've actually done all those things, it you have to take other steps to protect your copyright, because just because you have a copyright doesn't mean that you can't lose it. Depending on the contract you sign and what you agree to in the contract, you could very easily give away your copyright because you didn't understand what you were signing. If you have a trademark and someone infringes on the trademark and starts, using your trademark to sell other stuff, and you never say anything about it, you could lose your trademark. So there's a certain amount of due diligence and keeping track of what is going on, both internally with like the deals you make for your comic, and externally with other people kind of potentially using your comic, and making sure that you clamp down on that. So that was a very long answer, and I hope some of that helped. You have another question, so I'm going to answer that too. Hold on. If I plan to turn my comic book company into a full publishing label with multiple titles, should I trademark each comic title separately or the main brand name? In most cases, you're going to do both. Because like, if you look at something like Marvel, Marvel has a trademark in the word Marvel and in that red logo, but they also have significant numbers of trademarks in Spider-Man, Daredevil, X-Men, Punisher, you name it. Because for every type of good that a company produces with their character on it, the trademark office calls that a class of goods. When you get a trademark in, let's say, Spider-Man, you don't have a trademark to do everything everywhere. You have to pick one type of good or service associated with that trademark. So Spider-Man probably started out with comics, but there's also Spider-Man trademarks for hats, for video games, for movies, for t-shirts and socks and anything else you can think of. And at every stage, they had to get a different trademark for Spider-Man. So if you know that you're going to have a comic book company, and your comic book company is going to have multiple titles that are all going to have more than one issue, this doesn't help if you're just printing graphic novels that are one-offs. But if you're going to have titles that have multiple issues, then you're going to want to get a trademark in the name of your company and in every title that you have. And depending on the way your business works, you may want to have trademarks for a lot of the characters in a lot of the comics. So for example, they have a trademark in Spider-Man because Spider-Man is the name of the comic. It is also the name of the character. They also have, trademarks for people like, I don't know, Black Cat and Silver Sable and whatever. They may or may not have a trademark in Mary Jane or Robbie Robertson, because there's not a lot of Robbie Robertson merch floating around. So it may not be a thing. But for every major character, you might want a separate trademark, especially if you're doing deals with other companies where they're licensing different products for your different characters. A trademark in each one is going to be necessary for each one. But what I would not do is start registering trademarks in some kind of a shotgun approach, not knowing what you're going to be actually producing, because a trademark is not something that you can just sit on. You have to use it if you register it, which means if you're going to decide to sell t-shirts based on your comic, at a certain point, the trademark office is going to demand that you show them that you are actually selling t-shirts. Showing them you're selling t-shirts is not hard. You just give them a link to the website and say, this is where people can buy t-shirts with my character on it. That's it. But if you never make a t-shirt and you never have an online store to show that you're selling the thing, you will then lose the trademark and waste a lot of time and money. So when you know you're about to release a certain type of product, let's say your comic is up to issue 15, 20, and now you're going to do the convention circuit. You're going to make t-shirts. Well, the production cycle of shirts is going to be 6 to 9 months. Then file the trademark for the t-shirts, because by the time the trademark office asks you to prove what you're doing, which is usually a year and a half, you already got the storefront up, you already got the t-shirts designed, you're already selling t-shirts, and it's great. But don't file the trademark for the t-shirts now, you got no t-shirts because there's no point doing that. Hope that answers the question. What is the current state of distribution? Um, I'm assuming at this point you're talking about print distribution and digital distribution. So let's focus on the print part first. In print distribution, for all of you who are not aware, Diamond Distributor, the major distributor for comic books in comic book shops, went bankrupt in January. There's been a long, drawn out legal fight for the control of Diamond and the control of the inventory in Diamond. And comic book shops are not necessarily sure what is going on with distribution because the new owners of Diamond are not necessarily clear what it is that they're doing. And by the way, the old Diamond is still trying to sell off inventory that they didn't actually own and not pay the publishers. However, the of the new Diamond, the head of New Diamond, the Diamond is coming out of bankruptcy, is actually doing a keynote talk at New York Comic Con next week called the State of Print Distribution. So a lot of what they're planning on doing hopefully will be revealed at that keynote speech. But keep in mind, most of the major publishers have either gone to alternative distribution, which means they've gone to Lunar or Simon and Schuster or Penguin Random House or somebody else, or they have switched completely to digital distribution and crowdfunding, or they've gone out of business. There's been quite a few companies that are no longer in business because between getting squeezed between not getting paid by Diamond and not having a way to distribute new comics, they got nowhere to go, so they're gone. If you are a new publisher, it is going to be challenging to find distribution for your comics into the direct market. There are aggregators and other distribution companies that are trying to fill that gap. But some of those contracts, and I've seen some of those contracts are horrible. You do not want to sign them without understanding exactly what it is you are or are not getting in terms of your rights, your revenue, your responsibility, and your recovery. Like I said, I've negotiated some of those deals. Be very careful before you sign a comic book aggregator distribution deal. But the more important question is you have to ask yourself as a comic book publisher is, does my comic belong in the comic book shop in the first place? And I did a video about this a few weeks ago. Not every comic belongs in a comic book shop. The only comics that belong in a comic book shop are those comics where the readers actually go to comic book shops. If your reader is a digital native, like I talked about at the top of the show, and they're on Webtoons or they're on Global Comics, you don't need to fight to get into a comic book shop. If your readers go to Barnes and Noble, or they go to the library, or they go to Scholastic book fairs, or they go to conventions, or they go to crowdfunding, then you don't need to be in the direct market. It might be nice because, like I said, for all of us who love comics and you want to see your comic on the shelf just next to all the other comics that you grew up loving, that's great. But if your comic does not belong there, and that is based on who your demographic is in terms of your marketing, don't put your comic there, and then you don't have to worry about it. So hopefully, David, that answers your question. Next question is, what are the pros and cons of pen names? Well, most of the time, the clients that I've worked with who use pen names and have pen names, they are in one of two situations. One, they are making books that they do not necessarily want those books to be associated with them in the rest of their life. Whether they're making not safe for work books, or they're making books that are somehow politically charged, and they could get into actual trouble producing those books, they will produce those books under a pen name. The other situation is if you've already established yourself as and you have a certain following in one genre of books. Let's say you're known for horror books, and you know that you can sell quite a few books under your name, but you also want to do, children's books. But from a marketing standpoint, if parents see your name on a children's book, they will instantly run screaming because they know that you're into like gory human centipede type horror stuff. So if you want to have a different type of book come out, and you don't want to confuse the marketplace, just use a pen name instead of your real name. Now, from a legal standpoint, a lot of the contracts you're going to sign, you can sign it under your pen name, but everyone involved in the deal is going to want to know what your real name is because the money has to go to your real bank account. The copyright registration, even if it's under a pseudonym, has to go to a real person. So internally in your business dealings, you'll still have to a certain extent, use your real name. Your pen name is going to be more of a marketing and distribution device rather than a some sort of protection where no one's going to know who you are. The other way, if you don't want people to associate your books with you in your daily life, build a company like I was talking about before, release the books under the company name, and your name does not necessarily have to be prominent in the book. There's a tradition in comics that the writer, the artist, and sometimes the letter and colorist are actually given name credit on the book. But if it's your book and you don't want name credit, you don't have to put it there. And you can actually have provisions in your contract, because I do this not it's not often, but every once in a while, there are provisions in the contract that says you will only be referred to by your pen name, by your pseudonym. You will never be referred to in the marketplace, whether you're at a convention or you're the marketing materials or the videos or anything else. You will never be referred to by your name. And like I said, from a marketing and distribution standpoint, it will help. But inside whatever publisher you work with and everything like that, they're going to know who you are. They have to. Let's see. There's a question. Do you send the PDF of your finished comic to the copyright office? It depends on if your PDF is the best and latest version of the comic, then yes. If you're only publishing your comics digitally, then all you have to do is upload the PDF. They send you confirmation, and the process goes much faster. But if you do print the comic in any format, doesn't matter if it's a floppy or a graphic novel or a trade or whatever, then they're going to want you to print out what's called a shipping slip that you will get once you register the copyright, put it into the mail with a couple copies of your comic, and then send it to the copyright office, because what the copyright office will do with that print version is they will put it in the Library of Congress. So your book will be there with all of the hundreds of millions of other books in the Library of Congress, and that will be part of your registration before they mail the registration certificate to you. So again, if you're only doing digital, if you're only doing Webtoon, you don't need to give them a print copy. But if you're printing, like if you do a crowdfunding campaign or you have a creator-owned book, you're going to need to send them a printed copy. Again, in most cases, it's not complicated. It's not hard. The only time my clients use me to actually register their copyrights for them is because if they have so many that they do not want to take the time or the effort to actually sit down and do it themselves, they just have me do it. So like I have one client, they come out with like 9 to 12 books a month, and there's nobody in that office who's going to sit there and do 12 copyright registrations. So they say, Gamal, you do the 12 copyright registrations. I send the shipping slip to them. Their distribution department sends the comics to the Library of Congress, and Bob's your uncle. So that's the demarcation of whether or not you need to send in the PDF. You don't need, and at no point do you need to send in both. If you have the best version is a PDF, send the PDF. If the best version is the print version, send the print version. But you don't have to send the PDF and the print version. Here's a question. Are ash cans viable in 2026? If so, should an ash can be per character or per issue? The way my clients have been using ash cans over the past couple years is basically as a proof of concept, a low cost proof of concept to get the idea in that fixed medium of expression that we've been talking about in terms of copyright, and to test the market with it. They'll do low print runs, they'll use it, they'll hand them out in conventions to try, if they're trying to get a creator owned deal, the ash can give the potential publishers an idea of what the book is going to look like and may help them get a deal. The ash can may also be used in what's called direct to consumer, where you hand the ash can or sell the ash can to potential readers who might like your book to kind of get them on board, whether you're going to use it to get them to sign on to your mailing list or you're going to do something else to as a precursor to a crowdfunding campaign. An ash can be used that way. Now, depending on how you want to use it, your ash can may be the first scene or the first couple scenes of your first issue. It could be some of the background material, like the character design, character description, world building stuff that's not necessarily going to go into the comic, but is being used by your creative team to kind of build the actual finished comic. So it all really depends on who your market is, what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and how the ash can is going to fit into your wider publishing model. Because the ash can could be something that you use initially to kind of generate interest. And it also could be a backer reward at a certain tier when people get the comic and they get the ash can, because some people really like to, if they have a story that they're really invested in, they want to collect all of the artifacts associated with that story. In Japan, they used to call them otaku. I don't know what they call them here, but it's the people who, once they really want something, they want all of it. I think it was Kevin Kelly talked about the idea of a true fan. You get 1,000 true fans, and he was talking about music, but it applies to comics as well. You get a certain number of true fans. No one else in the world needs to know that you're making comics, because those people are buying literally everything associated with your comic. If you get enough of them, quit your day job, and now you're making comics. So the ash can be one of those assets and things that you use to build your comic book base. So it is definitely a tool that you can use as an interim step between, concept, digital comic, ash can, published comic. Speaking of digital, here's another question. How do you protect your comic or IP from being pirated once it's online? Are there different methods than what you'd use for print? Okay, to protect you, if you're going to publish digitally and you do not want the book to be pirated, first accept the idea that pirates are a very resourceful and dedicated group of individuals. And if they want to pirate your comic, they will pirate your comic. However, having said that, there's something called DRM, Digital Rights Management. And this creates a situation, it creates coding in whatever it is that you're producing that allows people to read it, but not download it, not copy it, not do anything else with it. And if you're on a system like Global Comics, you can apply DRM. If you're on Comixology, you can apply DRM. Now, the downside of that is, if you're using digital rights management, in most cases, your readers will not own the comic. They will have access to it for as long as you keep it online and they keep paying you, or however it is you want to set up the payments. And for a certain demographic of comic book reader, not being able to own the comic is a major turnoff for them. For a lot of times it breaks down across demographic lines. So boomers, Gen X, millennials, a lot of them want the finished comic. Gen Z, Gen Alpha, they don't care. They want to read the comic and they're going to move on because physical artifacts and owning a physical thing is less important to a digital native than it is to old people like me. All right. So, yes, you can protect your comic to a certain extent because even with DRM, if a pirate really wants your comic, they'll get your comic. But know that there's a downside depending on who's in your reader demographic to digital rights management. There's another question. If I'm submitting my comic to a publisher like Image, how can I protect my ideas and characters? Do creators ever use NDAs, or is copyright protection before submission enough? Copyright protection before submission is going to be infinitely more helpful than an NDA. Because in most comic book publishers, they won't sign an NDA. A lot of comic book publishers will not accept unsolicited pitches simply because they do not want to be accused of stealing somebody's idea. But you're going to get much farther if you actually register the copyright early. Then when you submit, make sure you understand the deal that's being put on the table. And a lot of publishers will also have you sign what's called a submission agreement. The submission agreement basically boils down to the idea that they get submissions all the time. And somebody else's submission may be very similar to yours. So the fact that they're accepting your submission does not mean they're on the hook to you if they happen to come out with an idea that is substantially similar to yours later on. And if you don't sign the submission agreement, they're not going to look at your pitch. So the key in that case is registering the copyright and, again, keeping track of what's being released in the market, especially what's being released in the genre that you're releasing in the circles you're releasing books. Because if a book comes out about a rich young man who suffers a tragic criminal event and then becomes a vigilante, and you had that idea too, you're not going to get very far, because what I just described was Batman, Moon Knight, Iron Man, Iron Fist, and like 50 other characters. But if your story happened to be, just for the sake of argument, two farmers who have to travel across a very dangerous country to drop a ring into a mountain that can only be destroyed in that mountain and save the entire world, and another story like that comes out, you have much more of a leg to stand on if you have filed the copyright. Because I just described The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings to you. And if someone else comes out with the same thing and they just switch some names around, then you've got a lot more leg to stand on. So worry less about NDAs, more about filing that copyright before you submit to publishers. I would actually strongly suggest filing the initial copyright for the script or the synopsis or whatever before you even go out to find artists or letterers or colorists. You want to have the confidence to know that that idea is yours before you actually engage anyone in the process of dealing with your comic. And the last thing that I will end with is, when you hire people to work on your comic, you have to be very clear in the contract that all of the work that they're doing, if they're working freelance, all the work that they're doing belongs to you. Because if you don't do that, you create a situation where you own the copyright to your comic and they own the copyright to your comic, because once you create something, unless you sign away the rights, you have the rights. So if you're hiring freelancers, make sure they sign a deal. If you're working with a collaborator and you're both going to share the ownership of the idea, that has to be in a contract too. Otherwise, you're both going to own the copyright and it's going to be a hot mess. Okay? So for everybody who's going to be at New York Comic Con next week, I will see you around. I will probably post my schedule early next week of the panels that I'm going to be on. You want to say hi? I'll be around. Say hi. The next episode of the Business of Comics podcast will be the following week. I believe that's I don't know what day it is. It's the week after Comic-Con. It'll be, but I will send out messages for everybody to actually join us. Thank you all for actually joining. If you have specific questions that you'd like me to answer in the next show or between shows, please contact me directly with your question. If you would like a free consultation about a specific deal that you're working on or a business that you're trying to build, again, reach out to me directly. We'll set you up with a free consultation and see how I might be able to help you out. So that's going to end this episode of the Business of Comics podcast. So everybody, please get off the internet and go make some comics.